The Watership Down podcast is intended for listeners who are familiar with the plot. There may be spoilers. This episode is scripted, narrated, recorded and edited by Newell Fisher. Many thanks to Wikipedia, Britannica.com and paradata.org.uk, which acts as a living history of the UK's parachute regiment and airborne forces, for their assistance with researching this episode. Hello, and welcome to the Watership Down podcast episode 103, in which, having reached the end of part 1 of Tales from Watership Down, we will be taking a one-episode break to look at the life and works of the author of Watership Down, Richard Adams. This podcast started during COVID lockdown nearly 2 years ago. Well, 2 years down the line, my turn to get COVID has come round at last. I'm on the mend, but this episode is still being recorded by someone who is full of COVID virus. Don't worry, I don't think you can catch it through your earbuds or speaker. Before we get to the subject of this episode, there are a couple of matters to comment upon. First of all, as an afterthought to Speedwell's story last week, it occurs to me that the story is structured, if that's the word, very much like a dream. Well, it reminded me of the kind of stories some of my dreams have told in the past. Secondly, I need to return to the concept of canon. As I've made clear before, my base assumption when it comes to Watership Down is that the canon consists of the original 1972 novel and the 1978 film. However, Tales from Watership Down was written by the original author Richard Adams, so I've seen the entirely reasonable view advanced that the whole book, by definition, is automatically canon. I've no doubt that I'm straying into areas of literary theory concerning ownership of narrative, etc. by claiming anything else, but that is the claim I want to explore. On the one hand, we have to surely take on board the overall reaction to Tales by fans of the original novel, which is best described as mixed. On the other hand, anything in Tales that seems to genuinely augment the narrative of the original novel should be considered as worthy of canon status. Quite a few examples of this can be found by this strict standard, believe me. And to be brutally honest, I find this approach more interesting. Also, when it comes to analysing film versions of Watership Down, plenty of which lie ahead, any first portrayal on film of something from the original novel will automatically be given canon status, an example being the shapes of the Warren of the Snares, which feature in the 1999 to 2001 TV series, but were absent from the 1978 film. Ultimately, though, there is no correct approach to this issue, and the fact that I'm defining canon in such a restricted way does not invalidate any other view at all. I just find that the approach I'm taking, which could be called open originalist, leads to a more interesting discussion. If that means I'm courting controversy, then I plead guilty as charged. So then, on to Richard Adams. The life and works of Richard Adams. Richard George Adams was born on Sunday the 9th of May 1920 in the suburb of Wash Common near Newbury in Berkshire, England, about half a mile southwest from the site of Sandalford Warren in Watership Down. His mother was Lillian Rosa Adams, née Button, and his father Evelyn George Beeden Adams, a doctor and probably the inspiration for Dr. Adams in chapter 48 of Watership Down, Dea Ex Machina. He attended Horace Hill Preparatory School from 1926 to 1933, from age 6 to 13. Preparatory schools form part of the English private school system. Horace Hill School lies close by Newtown Common, south of Newbury, the common the rabbits of Watership Down have so much trouble crossing after leaving Sandalford. From 1933 to 1938, aged 13 to 18, he attended Bradfield College, a public school also within the English private school system. For American listeners, this needs explanation. It is a peculiarity of the English private school system that public schools here are fee-paying private schools that are open to all, regardless of location or religious denomination, as long as you can afford the fees. They are very much not state-funded. Bradfield College lies some 10 miles north-east of Adams' birthplace, and thus his immediate geographical association with Sandalford Warren was ended while at school. In 1938, aged 18, Richard Adams attended Worcester College, part of the prestigious Oxford University, to study modern history. Oxford and Cambridge universities together are effectively the English Ivy League and are now referred to collectively as Oxbridge. By the way, when I refer to England when speaking of Adams' education, I really do mean England. The Welsh, and historically far more so the Scottish, education systems truly are separate in the UK, and let's not even go into the systems in Northern Ireland, where religious sectarianism in state schools is enshrined in law. Oops, I just did. Having entered university in 1938, Adolf Hitler had the bad manners to interrupt Richard Adams' university education due to the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, at least from a British perspective. In July 1940, 10 months after the UK entered the war, Adams was called up or conscripted to join the British Army. He was commissioned as an officer in the Royal Army Service Corps. I discussed the concept of commissioning officers in last week's episode, so I won't say any more on the subject here. Adams' basic training was carried out at the Royal Army Service Corps Training Centre at Buller Barracks in Aldershot from July to September 1940. This very military town lies at the north-east corner of Hampshire, the county in which most of Watership Down is set. After attending officer cadet training at Boscombe in neighbouring Wiltshire near Stonehenge, Adams was given an officer commission in the Royal Army Service Corps as a second lieutenant, the lowest commission rank, on the 30th of November 1940. His first posting was to a petrol supply company in Northern Ireland near Lough Neagh. That's the huge lake in Northern Ireland, or the north of Ireland, that you cannot miss. He was stationed there from early 1941 until mid-1942. Adams tried to get into the airborne forces but failed at his first attempt. He then requested an overseas posting, ending up at a petrol depot near the Palestinian city of Gaza until late 1943. Lieutenant Adams had definitely had enough of supplying petrol. Now Captain Adams, he completed a parachute course at RAF Ringway in the northeastern English county of Cheshire in January 1945. He was appointed as Brigade Royal Army Service Corps officer at 1st Parachute Brigade headquarters and took part in the liberation of Denmark in May 1945. After leaving the army in early 1946, he returned to Worcester College, Oxford, at the age of 26 to complete his studies for 2 more years. He gained the degree of Bachelor of Arts in 1948, aged 28, and Master of Arts in 1953, aged 33. In 1948, having gained his degree, he joined the civil service. In 1949, he married the daughter of a Royal Air Force squadron leader, Elizabeth Dyke Ackland. In the civil service, he rose to the rank of Assistant Secretary to the Ministry of Housing and Local Government, later part of the Department of the Environment, where he worked until 1968. He lived with his wife at Whitworth on the River Test in Hampshire, just under 3 miles from the site of Ephrata, for the rest of his life. They had 2 daughters, Juliet, born in 1958, and Rosamond, born in 1960. Richard Adams' writing career did not begin until he was middle-aged, a fact I find very consoling. He began writing short stories while working in the civil service. An important part of the mythos of Watership Down is that the story began with Adams telling his daughter's stories on a car trip to Stratford-on-Avon, home of the Royal Shakespeare Company. Hilariously and somewhat naively, in episode 2 of this podcast I questioned how he could have told the whole story that way. Obviously he didn't, but the parts he did tell had sufficient impact for them to urge him to write them down. He began writing the book that would become Watership Down in 1966, aged 46, taking 2 years to complete it. It wasn't published until 4 years later in 1972, as publishers simply didn't know how to categorise it. Eventually, Rex Collings, an independent children's book publisher, agreed to publish the book, and the rest is history. It was also Collings who gave it its title, the original one having been Hazel and Fiver. As a result of the book's success, Adams was awarded both of the most prestigious British Children's Book Awards, a rare honour. In 1974, Adams' second novel, Shardik, was published, and it was only then that he left the civil service to become a full-time writer. Shardik was a fantasy novel with an imaginary setting concerning a huge bear that becomes the focus of a militaristic religion. Adams was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature in 1975. He wrote 2 works of non-fiction in collaboration with Max Hooper, Nature Through the Seasons in 1975 and Nature Day and Night in 1978. His third novel, Plague Dogs, was published in 1977. This bleak novel also turned into a film in 1982 by the same team who produced Watership Down 1978, concerned two dogs who escaped from an animal experimentation laboratory. It was definitely no children's book, and it is unbearably sad. These dogs are no Raspberry Woof, and are treated with the same respect as the anthropomorphised rabbits of Watership Down. In 1980, the suspense novel The Girl in a Swing was published, a story about a complex and disturbing relationship between an English collector of fine pottery and a mysterious Danish woman. It was adapted for film in 1988. Another non-fiction book followed in 1982 called Voyage Through the Antarctic, written in collaboration with Ronald Lockley, author of The Private Life of the Rabbit, which helped inspire and inform Watership Down. This followed an expedition to the Antarctic they made together. That year, Adams also served 1 year as president of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Maya, published in 1984, was set in the same Becklen Empire as Shardik and was a prequel to that book. Traveller, published in 1988, tells the story of the American Civil War told from the point of view of Confederate General Robert E. Lee's favourite horse. Adams wrote an autobiography titled The Day Gone By in 1990. Then, in 1996, Tales from Watership Down was published. The Outlandish Night, a historical novel, was published in 1999. In 2006 he wrote Daniel, a novel about a former slave who becomes an abolitionist. The last recorded work I can find by Adams was a short story called Leopard Aware, published in 2010 as part of an anthology of animal stories entitled Gentle Footprints. This was written just before his 90th birthday to help raise money for the animal charity the Born Free Foundation. He celebrated his 90th birthday that same year at the White Hart in Whitchurch, Hampshire. 2 years later, at the Whitchurch Arts Show, Adams was interviewed for YouTube discussing the 40th anniversary edition of Watership Down along with the illustrator Aldo Galli. It is well worth a watch. Richard Adams died on the 24th of December 2016, aged 96, in Oxford. A statement from his family on the Watership Down website read, "Richard's much-loved family announce with sadness that their dear father, grandfather and great-grandfather passed away peacefully at 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve." This was followed, very movingly, by the passage at the end of Watership Down in which Hazel leaves his body behind. Richard Adams' writing career, having started quite late in his life, began with his most well-known work, Watership Down. The success of that novel seemed to overshadow all his subsequent works, with only Plague Dogs seeming to come close in terms of its impact. Was starting out with his biggest success a blessing or a curse? In any case, he never seemed to begrudge having had his greatest success in writing first, and it is fitting that his epitaph included some of its closing lines. Next time, we begin looking at Section 2 of Tales from Watership Down.